Well, distinguished participants, thank you for giving me this warm welcome. My contribution today differs greatly from most of the others' contributions we have heard during this remarkable human rights conference. My predecessors at this rostrum have witnessed how brutal regimes have, in difficult ways, tried to stop and stifle the human rights defenders. I'm nothing but a university professor. I'm a person you might call a human rights expert. But there is a large, unsurmountable gap between a human rights expert and a human rights victim. So I stand before you in deep respect. The reason for inviting me to this conference was primarily that I was responsible for drafting the United Nations Human Rights Defenders Declaration. This declaration protects now the human rights defenders. And as you heard, I'm also involved with human rights defenders issues in my capacity as president of the European Commission for Democracy Through Law. It's better called the Venice Commission. This commission now has 56 member states. Brazil was the last joining the commission, and now it covers roughly 1.2 billion people. I shall leave the Venice Commission and go back to my past in the United Nations. On December 9, 1998, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN General Assembly in New York adopted the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. Some 15 years of work, with disappointment as well as promising moments, were successfully brought to an end. The human rights community, NGOs as well as states, was surprised and pleased. The declaration was seen as yet another milestone in the struggle for universal respect for human rights. The exercise started back in 1985 when the Human Rights Commission established a working group to draft this declaration. And as you can imagine, 85, the project was a compromise between the traditional competing political and ideological forces in the United Nations at that time. The first session took place in Geneva in 86, the last 12 years later in 98. Since the first day, I was a Norwegian representative, and during the last 5 years, I was chairman for the exercise. Isn't 12 years of drafting history terribly long? Yes, but we shall have to recall that from the very beginning, very few resources were put into this project. Gradually, more and more resources was given to us, and at the end, during the 2 last years, I was mandated by the working group to work between the sessions. That is, to my knowledge, rather unique in the Human Rights Commission at that time. So from a practical perspective, I was struggling with the draft declaration through a couple of years, not on a full-time basis, but I was frequently confronted with the outstanding difficult issues as I was traveling to meet with the key actors. I consulted governments, NGOs, and others. The NGOs played an important role during the drafting process. Since the declaration was going to be their declaration, I gave the NGO the same place and the same role in the working group as governments had. That was unusual, and some ambassadors clearly felt that I gave them too much prominence. But I kept that position until the end, and no government formally challenged my decision. To better understand the declaration, it might be conducive to recall the political context and background when the project started. The initiative to launch this project was a product of the Cold War. As a matter of fact, the Cold War initiated the project, but the Cold War also almost paralyzed the first year of the exercise. From the very beginning, the drafting process was based on a text which was proposed by the governments of Canada and Norway. I feel it is correct to say that this was a modest, constructive text which avoided the most extreme ideological points of view. But the discussions in the working group reflected the world outside. One can easily trace the East-West conflict as well as the North-South tensions. Many governments in the East and in the South perceived the whole exercise as an attack from the West and the North. Sadly, on some occasions, this was also true. It was difficult to avoid ideological attacks and steer the debate into a constructive direction. A lot of patience was needed. Then the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Iron Curtain disappeared. Which implications did these events have on the working group? Some governments, which from the very beginning had been rather skeptical, even hostile to the whole exercise, turned to become very friendly and supportive. The political differences did not disappear completely, however, but they changed. The theater did not change. The stage was more or less the same. The only change was that new governments entered into the old role figures. The conflict tipped from an East-West conflict into a North-South conflict, like in so many global fora at that time. And this was certainly not a conflict created by the South only. Some of the governments in the North contributed to the problems. Before the last session in '98, I presented a consolidated text which covered all the outstanding issues. Let me just briefly mention some of the more controversial issues we had to fight with. The declaration is a global text in a very complicated and very sensitive area. Even the concept human rights defender was extremely controversial. The working group deliberately avoided entering into a long process of defining this concept in an exact manner. As was frequently stated by one of the delegates, remember, my human rights defender is your terrorist.